Hello, and welcome to the second video for the Baroque section of MUHL 5300, the Graduate Music History Online Review course. This video will cover primarily secular vocal music. Before we begin, notice here that ideally you should read chapters 13 through 17 in your textbook and print out your scores or save them to your computer so that you can view them during the course of the lecture presentations. Additionally, the recordings that are mentioned in these videos are available through your Spotify list, which is linked through Blackboard. So go to that address and ideally open up a separate window in your browser so that you can stop the video when we get to one of the relevant slides and go to the Spotify list and listen to the piece. Then you can come back to the video and get more notes and move on to the next piece. The Baroque era, and especially when one discusses secular vocal music, begins with Claudio Monteverdi. 1567 to 1643, his life and his career function as a musical bridge across the periods from the Renaissance, late Renaissance, to the early Baroque. As you can see here, his career started when he was quite young, and he wrote his first book of motets and then his first book of madrigals, and trained in this older Renaissance style. His first post, starting in 1590, was with the Gonzaga family in Mantua. An example of one of his early madrigals is Se nel partir da voi, and you can see the text here. It's very typical for madrigals of the late Renaissance. It speaks of leaving the beloved, heavy torment, and of course, lady, I would prefer or be able to die. And so we see that and hear that a lot in the text of these late Renaissance madrigals. You'll remember that from part 2 of the class when we talked about typical Renaissance madrigals. So please go ahead and stop the video here and go to the Spotify list. By about 1600, Monteverdi's music was already being criticized in the press of the day. One of the most ardent critics of his work was Giovanni Maria Artusi, who basically argued that Monteverdi's music lacked a good foundation because he was basically breaking the old rules of counterpoint. And he says, of course, additionally, that they go out of the bounds of good taste by striving to create novelties. Now, Artusi actually was not looking at the text of any of these works, nor did that really interest him at all. He was only looking at the music and noticing that things were not as they should be in his world. Dissonances were not prepared, and fast changes or modulations were occurring where they should not. This is the basis for his criticism. Of course, as you remember from the Renaissance unit, we talked about the end of the period and how there were Mannerist influences that were changing the aesthetics of the day. And so these are some of the things that affected Monteverdi and his contemporaries to create a more dramatic musical style. So again, by 1600, as I mentioned, while his music is being criticized, he basically says that he's part of a new musical style, a musical style that they could begin to call the Seconda Pratica. His response was couched as a letter from his brother, which appeared in the introduction to his fourth book of madrigals. And in that letter, he says that the Prima Practica was concerned primarily with harmony and the perfection of that harmony. Secunda Practica, however, this new practice, was concerned with the perfection of the setting of the text. And he says the phrase, quote, where the words are the mistress of the harmony, end quote, meaning that the words are more important. The words dictate the harmony. Book 4 is a sort of turning point. We really start to see the Secunda Práctica. So go ahead and listen to the example listed here, Lo mi songio Veneta, and notice as you listen to it the extreme word painting on words like canto and fuggi. All right, so go ahead and stop the video here and go listen to that piece. What about music now? And so philosophers, historians, poets, musicians all began trying to find out what this ancient style sounded like. And so we get this idea that several people published on at the time, again in the 1580s, about primitive simplicity. It was an idea that music in ancient times was very affective. It had affect, and that affect would, by scientific properties that weren't completely understood, sound could enter into the human body through the ear, and in so doing, affect the listener, make the listener feel things and believe things that he or she may not have felt or even believed before hearing the music. And this was considered very powerful. It was something that Renaissance musicians wanted to recreate. Some of the most devoted figures to this search for effective music were in the Florentine Camerata, which was active in the 1570s and 80s. Members, as you see on this slide, included the patron, Count Giovanni de Bardi, Vincenzo Galilei, father of Galileo Galilei, Giulio Caccini, the musician responsible for the collection of songs shown on the right of the slide, Le Nuove Musiche, Ottavio Rienchini, a poet and later, of course, one of the librettists for the earliest operas, and Girolamo May, the historian and archaeologist, who was actually going to ancient lands and finding the information that helped to fuel the discussions of the Florentine Camerata. By the 1580s, the Florentine Camerata were creating full-blown works. These were basically intermedio, the plural being intermedi. They are written throughout in this style called monody. Not yet recitative, not really aria, something in between. An example includes Francesca Caccini's piece, a strophic monody, Lasciatemi chi solo. Please go ahead and stop the video here and go listen to that piece. Now, intermedio, or intermedi, plural, were completely sung entertainments that appeared between the acts of a longer play. These were generally fairly short works, certainly maybe only about 10-15 minutes long, usually only about 2 to 4 characters. Very simple storylines that weren't usually related to the play that they were appearing with. They just happened between the acts, and they were often mythological or moralistic in character. Monody, as we've already seen in Caccini's Le Nuove Musiche, were single vocal lines with an accompaniment. And you can see in this slide one singer with a theorbist, or the singer accompanying herself in the bottom image. These monodies were very much speech-driven in their rhythm and used extensive ornamentation. The Camerata by 1600 went on to expand this idea of the intermedio. to something larger, something that was a full blown entertainment. And so, one of the first examples of these is Eurydice by Jacopo Peri, which appeared in 1601. Now, although it is not on your slide, um, Caccini also produced his production of Eurydice in 1601. And so there was a bit of a competition to see who could get the first expanded intermedio, or what came to be known as opera, out to the public in a published form. Monteverdi's Orfeo, which is a retelling of the same story, appeared in 1607. Now, as it says on your slide, this, of course, is not the first opera, and it's not the first version of the story, but it combines old and new elements, including madrigals and dance, as well as monody, to create a piece called Drama per Musica. Orfeo, just to give you a few statistics here, 1607, text is by the librettist Alessandro Striggio, and it was composed for a large ducal wedding. It's not an intermedio, it is the main event. Just a quick rundown here of the acts. We have 5 acts, and we start with a prologue in which music sings of the power of music. And then in Acts 1 and 2, we celebrate Orpheus's marriage to Eurydice. It's only toward the end of Act 2 that we get the notice of Eurydice's death. Act 3, Orpheus travels to Hades with Hope as his guide and sings the very important piece Possente Spirito, which we'll be talking about on a later slide. And in Act 4, he confronts the god and goddess of hell and convinces them to return his wife. Of course, there is a stipulation that he cannot turn around and look back at her. And Orpheus is so convinced that he can do this, but he doesn't completely trust. And so, of course, right before the end of Act 4, Orpheus turns to look at Eurydice and she vanishes. Act 5, Orpheus is consumed by grief, but his father, Apollo, comes down from the clouds and tells him that he can find Eurydice's beauty in the eternal stars. And that's the end of the opera. So Striggio changes the storyline from one that is essentially tragic to a kind of happy ending. Eurydice does not come back, she stays dead, but Orpheus is consoled. And this is a form of Neoplatonism, which is very appealing, especially to the sort of ducal families of Italy in this period. On this slide, you can see an image of Possente Spirito from its original publication in 1607, 1608. And notice, though, there's an arrow there on your screen. You see 2 different lines of Possente Spirito. This is not a 2-part piece. What Monteverdi is giving us here are 2 different versions of the aria. And so he's giving us an unornamented line on the top and an ornamented line on the bottom. And at first glance, you might think, oh, the top line is for your less skilled singer and your bottom line is for your more skilled singer, but it's actually the opposite. Monteverdi would have assumed that trained singers of the day would know how to ornament that top line for themselves. So that bottom line where he gives ornamentation or suggestion of ornamentation is for amateurs or novice singers to give them an idea of how they might go about ornamenting that line. So, but please go ahead and see the video that I have linked for you in the video section of the Baroque unit if you would like a dramatization of this very important piece. Now, we mentioned affect earlier. René Descartes, with his publication, The Passions of the Soul, talks about what in the soul is a passion, in the body is an action. And so he says that there are six simple passions that dictate human action: wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. And he goes on to describe them in this text. This comes from ancient theories of rhetoric, but basically the idea is to organize emotions, but also to give an idea of what emotions one is inspired to feel by art, by nature, and by other external stimuli. And so, what happens in this period, in the Baroque period, is that artists, architects, and um, naturalists, writers of all types, take on the use of these affections as a way to understand human emotion, but also to try to work with and stimulate human emotions. Now, our next slide is changing gears a little bit, just to mention that we have women in music in the Baroque period, and we certainly had women in music before this, in the Renaissance, the medieval, and even in ancient times. But in the Baroque, we really start to see women take a leading role, not only as musicians themselves, but also as patrons, as composers, in some cases, as performers, and also both in courts and in convents. Francesca Caccini, whose dates are here, lived a very full life as a musician. And part of the reason for this, both as a musician and a composer, was one, the placement of her father, but also because she worked for the Medici family. And so her job with the Medici family helped to protect her and allowed her to have a very full life as a composer in this period. Barbara Strozzi, again, her dates here, 1619 to 1677, led also a very full life as a poetess and a composer. And part of this is because she was born into or adopted into another very powerful family in Florence at the time, the Strozzi family. They were the second most powerful family in Florence after the Medici. And so she was trained in opera composition by Francesco Cavalli, one of Monteverdi's students, and she wrote monodic songs and cantata. An example is the piece Lagrime Me. In the early Baroque period, it was just a piece that came from the verb cantare, to sing. And so these earlier pieces alternated different affects or different singing styles. And so some were more monodic and some were a little bit more song like. But in the later Baroque, the cantata expands with many different composers, including Bach, and we get a chorale cantata, these multi movement works that have duets, choruses, and solo pieces. But a cantata is always a piece that features the voice and usually has lots of smaller internal sections. So, back to opera. Let's talk about opera development in France, Italy, and England. Opera in France starts with the genre the ballet de cour. These pieces were not sung very much, although there is some song in them, but it's mostly about dance and instrumental music and the grandeur of the dance and even the costuming, as you can see in the image on the right, featuring King Louis XIV. As opera continues to develop in France, we get the comédie ballet and eventually the tragédie en musique. The comédie ballet was a interesting genre that was pioneered by Lully along with his librettist Molière. And the tragédie en musique was Lully's later effort to create a very serious genre that was all sung or sung throughout, and began to employ this new genre he called the French overture. This slide gives a little background on Jean-Baptiste Lully and his life. As we just said, he created the Tragédie en musique and the French Overture, which has two parts. The first part is slow with dotted rhythms, and the second part is fast and imitative. Throughout his career, he worked closely under King Louis XIV and created a style that was, for his day, essentially French in sound. Go ahead and stop the video here and listen to his overture to the opera Armide. Opera in Italy in the Baroque period continued to develop and developed a new style called opera seria, very serious and important topics, usually around myths and heroes. These operas featured this new style of aria called the da capo aria, and you can see the form here A, B, A prime, which basically means that we have an A section, a contrasting B section, and then we go back to the head or the beginning of the work, sing the A part again, but this time with a lot more embellishment, a lot more vocal ornamentation from the singer. Additionally, in opera seria, we get the beginning of a true recitative. No more do we have this monodic in-between style of singing. We now have something that we recognize as recitative. Also, in opera seria, there's an emphasis on the singer's virtuosity. We get very strong lead characters, strong female soprano divas, and also, in particular, the ascendancy of the male soprano, also called the castrato, which we'll talk more about on the next slide. The opera seria also had things like the exit convention, which meant that after the singer was done singing, he or she would actually bow and leave the stage. This is a bit of a challenge to the drama of the work. Now, back to that castrato figure I mentioned earlier. Male singers, as you can read here, were surgically altered to maintain their high soprano voice. One of the most famous of these castrati was Carlo Bruschi, also known by his stage name Farinelli. And so their voices were altered because it allowed them to have quite a high range, of course, but also their voices carried. They were very strong and they could fill these larger concert halls that were developing in the period. Go ahead and stop the video here if you like, because I have a video that I linked for you in the video area that is from the movie Farinelli, and it gives you a little insight into the popularity of these figures in the day. Now, opera in England is a little bit more problematic. England wanted to adopt the novelties that they saw in Italy and in France, but they had a problem with the use of music throughout a dramatic piece. It was not realistic, and they wanted this new monody, these new styles, but they just couldn't figure out how to incorporate it in a realistic way. Some of the experiments that developed over the Baroque period included the masque, the semi-opera, and a later development in the early 1700s, the ballad opera. Now, masques were a bit like the ballet de cour. They were traditional danced entertainments, usually with a fairly small dramatic content. Semi-operas were actually an effort to create something that was an expanded operatic experience. The play, a normal spoken play, would go on for 3 or more acts, and these semi-operas, these musical segments, appeared between those acts, and ostensibly they're related to the play. They were usually developed at the same time, but many times when we look at these semi-opera musical parts, they're only tangentially related to the plot. Ballad operas were probably the most successful creation at the time and are a lot like modern musicals because they incorporate both spoken aspects and sung pieces. In this case, in ballad operas, based on popular tunes that people recognized and found very appealing. The most important and prolific composer of the day in England was Henry Purcell, and he was considered to be the best English composer until the 20th century. He's also called the Orpheus Britannicus and wrote in really every genre of the period. His most important operatic piece, though, his only operatic piece, is the small chamber opera Dido and Aeneas. We believe it premiered in 1689 at a school for young gentlewomen. The text is by the then poet laureate Nahum Tate, and the story comes from Virgil's Aeneid about the survivor Aeneas, who goes on after the fall of Troy to go to create the new Troy, which becomes Rome. He's lost in a storm, however, in northern Africa, lands in Carthage, falls in love with Dido, and then the gods come and tell him that he has to go. The piece that is in your listening is the piece Ah Belinda, in which Dido admits that she has something really bothering her, some feelings that she cannot express. And listen for the ground bass running throughout the piece, moving in a downward motion throughout. So, to put Baroque musical trends or encapsulate them, we have, of course, the doctrine of the affections, we have an emphasis on virtuosity, new music and new musical innovations are very important. Um, there's the development of public music concerts, an increase in music printing, which makes music more available, and we still have improvised as well as oral traditions that are working alongside this published music. This is just the second lecture in our Baroque series, so please go to your textbook and also, of course, to the Total Access site that is provided through the Norton website, which is the link is here. And of course, you'll find their outlines and flashcards and review quizzes and all of that information to help you study this further.